I'm going to just spend a few minutes sort of giving the nuts and bolts of why early matters, because you've heard that now several times. And I'll talk a little bit about toxic stress, a term that the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child came up with Frameworks Institute back in 2004 after 2 years of battles amongst the scientists about whether that was the appropriate term to use for early adverse experiences. And we'll talk a little bit about brain architecture. This is the largest screen I've ever stood in front of. So, wow. I need a ladder. So here are some common misconceptions about development. And so see if you can fill in the blanks. Children are, what is that? Sponges. Just put them down, put them in the middle of a room, they'll hear people talking, and that's all you need to do because they just soak up information. And that ain't how it works, as we say in New Jersey, which is where I was born. Right? Children are not sponges. Oh, thank you. And we'll talk about what are the ingredients for the development of social, emotional, and cognitive skills, because the development of those are inextricably intertwined. The brain's not partitioned in a way where they each work separately. And children certainly are not sponges that passively take in information and somehow magically incorporate it. 80% of brain development occurs by, there are 3 candles on there, come on. Nobody gets my pictures, I don't understand it, by the age of 3. Now, it is true that if you calculate the size of the brain, it's about 80% of what it's going to be in adulthood. But the foundations are laid prenatally through the first 3 years, but we overproduce more nerve connections than we're going to use. Experience plays a really important, dramatic role in furthering the development of the brain itself. And so while the brain is growing at an unbelievably rapid rate, 700 connections per second from the 3rd trimester through the first 2 years of life, that doesn't mean that things are finished then. We're creating the foundation for what's going to happen over the course of childhood and adolescence and even into adulthood. Bad stuff happens. You just have to be tough. I couldn't find another picture that was sort of obvious about that. And this is not about internal weakness. Resilience, the ability to respond to adversity in a balanced and positive way, to come through tough situations. There's actually a skill set that you're going to hear about over the course of the day from a number of the other scientists about executive function, about emotional regulation and temperament, the sorts of things. Those are skills. Just like we think about skills about kicking a soccer ball or learning how to read. These are skill sets that can help build resilience in children and take it with them as they grow into adulthood. And it's not about internal character strength or rugged individualism, which is sort of part of our American culture. It really is about brain and child development. Ready to learn is all about, right, numbers or letters or whatever, and it's not that those aren't important to understand. It's not that those aren't important to learn about, but it's not done in isolation. So that's not really what learning, ready to learn is all about. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about what the Council developed over the last 10 years. And I refer to the Council because, you know, you're going to hear from scientists today, and we didn't go to PhD school to learn how to communicate this stuff very well. So we're sort of flying by the seat of our pants in some way and working with people who really understand how to communicate this in an effective way where you can use it in your own domains, in your own areas, your spheres of influence that allows you to translate this into meaningful content. So child development is the foundation of prosperous communities. The reason why Art Rolnick and Jim Heckman came to our early meetings was because we needed to understand whether we just thought this because we were doing important scientific work or whether it was the reality. And when you have people independent from another field tell you this is the best investment we can make for all sorts of reasons, then this statement is absolutely rock solid. It is the foundation for prosperous communities. And you can go from state to state now and look at the problems that different states are having and realize that foundationally this is where it starts. The real problems start very, very early. Brains are built over time from the bottom up. So skill begets skill. So genes and environment work together to build the brain. I was talking to people yesterday about this. The reason I went into developmental neuroscience is, from my perspective, I still can't comprehend the strategy that the brain uses to further its own development. And that is, there's a blueprint that's laid out during prenatal development to sort of get some of the basic wiring down. Particularly, earliest circuits that develop are the senses. So why would senses develop so early compared to other functions that are going to have to come online? So I can wait for an answer, or I can just tell you. Gary, go ahead. Go for it. In order to interact with their world, child is born, the senses are online. Smell, touch, hearing, and they've been actually hearing prenatally. Their visual system's wired. They use all these senses to be able to take in information from the world and utilize it to further its own development. Why do infants become face experts so rapidly, so early? Well, if I'm seeing a face and the next thing I know, I'm getting fed because I'm hungry, boy, what a great association that is. So what am I going to pay attention to? I'm going to pay attention to that face. It's contingent learning is so fundamental early on, and when babies use their senses to be able to develop those components. And skills start, in terms of these basic circuits, simply to be able to interact with the world and then use that information to build more complex skill sets. And when I talk to business leaders or policymakers, I always say, how many of you coach children in some sort of a team? And they raise their hand. And how many of you practice? What is practice like? You go out and you play a game. Oh, no, we don't do that. What do you do? Oh, we practice basic skills. Oh, why do you do that? Right? Because you're creating a foundation for that individual to take that simple and basic skill and be able to use it to do more complex things. And that's essentially how the brain gets built. First with the senses, and then being able to interact with your environment as your motor system begins to wire up more precisely, and then to be able to tune your attention systems. What are you going to pay more attention to? Your emotional systems to be able to regulate under stressful conditions and begin to recognize all the array of emotions that that you're experiencing as an infant and as a toddler. Okay, genes and experience together build brains. And I have in parentheses that reminder for me that the most important element of how these things come together is through something that we call serve and return. These are relationships. These are interactions between an infant and the adults in their life. And that there's no substitute at all for the quality interactions that occur from the very beginning and help build these basic skill sets. So in the absence of serve and return, what we might call neglect, which by the way is a toxic stress, right? That absence of interaction actually has significant effects on brain architecture, not in a good way, right? So the building of the brain requires a social context and interaction to occur. That's how healthy circuits get built. And you're going to hear much more about that from scientists who are far more expert in it than I am. So I've already mentioned this. I think Vicki mentioned this. I think Art mentioned this. Everybody is going to mention this, that cognitive, social, and emotional development are inextricably intertwined. And that's because the circuitry that's responsible for learning and cognition also overlap part of the same circuits overlap with social behavior, learning social behavior and social cognition. And some of those circuits overlap with those that are involved in regulating our emotions. And so when we have to do complex tasks, like keep our cool under a stressful situation, think of the air traffic controller, right, who has to keep his or her cool when some pattern of plane activity is coming into the airport that they've never seen before. There's a component of each of these systems that's responsible for that individual being able to perform at their very best. So these circuits are inextricably intertwined from the beginning, and it turns out that many of those circuits are profoundly sensitive to early experience, and the early experience, either good or bad, can have impacts on the actual structure and the chemistry of the brain, what we call brain architecture. So, there's number 5. So toxic stress damages brain architecture. This is what we argued about for 2 years on the council, because we didn't want to send flares up and say, well, you know, everybody needs to panic, right? So what we did, if you go back and read the paper that I think was published, I think it went online. These are all online that you can go and read. We came up with a nomenclature for stress, because not all stress is bad. So people were immediately thinking, oh, stress, we want to make sure that we pack our infants in cotton into the egg carton so that they don't experience anything that might be challenging, and that's not what we're saying at all. So there's a nomenclature, 3 levels that we define. One is called positive stress, in which a child might experience some challenge. For me, when I was growing up, it was standing in front of, well, an audience much smaller than this, circle time, right? I stressed out like you wouldn't believe because I didn't have fluent speech and whatever. I don't want to go into, with too many psychiatrists in the audience. But those positive stressors actually are good, because they allow our systems to be able to adapt, our circuits that regulate our emotions, to be able to learn how to adapt to challenges. And that's important for us. That's just as important as learning any of the cognitive skills that we talk about in terms of what's going on and being ready for learning in school. Then there's tolerable stress. Bad things happen in people's lives, in families, unemployment, moving a lot, the loss of a loved one, all sorts of things that you can name, which could be really challenging for an infant or a toddler, young child, to be able to deal with. But tolerable means that in the context of supportive relationships, again, I'm back to relationships, and you're going to hear more about this. Those relationships are critical for buffering the adverse events that, without that, will become toxic, will have effects on brain architecture. And then finally, toxic stress, which I've already mentioned, severe, prolonged, repetitive adversity. Neglect makes up about 80% of toxic stress in the United States, according to the CDC and Health and Human Services. So the absence of interaction, right, that's number 1 on the list. We tend to focus on child safety, and those are important issues in terms of adversity, physical abuse, other kinds of abuse that we can actually see. Neglect is far more challenging, but nonetheless has effects on how the brain structure develops. So these experiences change the wiring of the brain, particularly in parts of the brain that are important for developing executive functions, which you're going to hear about, and resilience. The frontal lobe, which is up here. In our brains, it occupies about 30-35% of our total brain volume. In a rodent, it occupies about 5%. So rodents don't have a lot of executive function. Just a touch. Just a touch. The scientists over there are laughing. And so those structures that are wired through our frontal lobe are particularly sensitive to toxic stress. I have a few more minutes left. So resilience, said, is not an internal character strength, but rather is built through combined impact of genes and environment. through the experiences that a child has. Again, think about the miracle of how the brain develops. Again, it's not the kidney, it's not the heart. I love my heart and I love my kidney, but the brain furthers its own development through experiences and builds circuits that allow individuals to be able to adapt and respond in a very positive way, right? Even when there are challenges. So those are skill sets, those are complex skill sets that emerge over time. And you're going to hear how long some of those actually take to develop, even through adolescence. And if anyone has a teenager, anyone have a teenager? Does anybody know a teenager? Does anybody doesn't want to know a teenager? Right. If you think brain development is finished by the age of 3, just, exactly, okay. Then teenagers become hopeless. Okay. So, number 7, here we go. For many functions, the brain capacity for change decreases over time. This is just cost-effectiveness factor. We can change brain architecture and brain chemistry through a process that we call plasticity, right, where experiences can drive those changes, but it becomes much more difficult and much less cost-effective to be able to do it later on. This is why starting out with an early, strong foundation from prenatal through the first 3 years as we're building these circuits up. Think about if you're building a house, how easy it is to change its organization or its design early in the process, as opposed to waiting until it's completely done and you say, oh, I didn't want that wall there, right? So the same sort of process of thinking. So, what do all these have in common? I think I put some positive psychology, primary care, speech, language, early child care and education, positive exposure, occupational therapy, physical exercise, which you're going to see and hear about, spiritual, physical therapy, child-parent counseling. For addressing challenges to healthy development, what do all these have in common? What do they have in common? They all impact brain architecture. Now, this is the adult brain that Brodmann drew out in 1909, and these are the 51 different cortical brain areas that he was able to see in terms of differences in architecture. That's the adult. This is really what we're dealing with here. Right? This is the architecture of a toddler. And if anybody doesn't believe that it's about the whole person, calm down. 1 minute. I can let them laugh a little longer, right? Okay. If anybody doesn't believe that this is about the whole child, look at what's here. Now, some people believe that the wine region in males never goes away. Right. So, but it's funny and there's some, it's humorous, but it's actually the reality of what that toddler is thinking about and what's going through their mind. And it's so much integration of information in their daily lives, using this as a way to further their own development. And that serve and return component, that relational component, we're social beings. It's so important. I cannot overemphasize that. And you're going to hear about that from other scientists during the course of the day about what research tells us about the importance of these interactions in building this architecture. I also have architecture for teenagers, but there's usually just one big area. So I want to thank you very much.